11. Perry sat, elbows resting on the console, chin cupped in hands, and watched the people flow past on the monitor screen. The point of view of the unseen camera was at about chest height, and every so often it turned about to face another direction. Occasionally, people would appear to be looking directly at her, which meant they had glanced at the medallion the doctor was wearing on a chain round his neck, within which the miniature camera was concealed. It also contained a tiny microphone, which transmitted the hubbub of conversation that filled the Forum Romanum through which the doctor was currently making his way. At the moment, Perry had muted the volume and was staring at the almost silent picture with frustration, contemplating the irony of the situation. Here I am, she thought, in the middle of ancient Rome, at least a version of ancient Rome, having come with the object of rubbing shoulders with the actual genuine people of the time, and the best I can do now is watch them on television, courtesy of the Doctor's own hidden eye channel. So, okay, it's great that the Doctor's out and about safely, and the morphic resonator concealed in his wristband seems to be working, but let's face it, it's simply boring being cooped up in here like the bird woman of Alcatraz. Irritably, she scratched the patch of feathers on her arm. The miniature audiovisual equipment had been another item the Doctor had suddenly recalled he had tucked away somewhere just before he left an hour earlier. With it had come a pea-sized earpiece and a throat microphone, which he had concealed under a light scarf. This had given them two-way communications, a boon which Perry had almost instantly regretted, as it allowed her to witness, with an alarming sense of helplessness, and occasional unintentional giggles, the Doctor's descent through the temple roof skylight and down onto a gallery level below, hanging from what Perry thought was an inadequately slender cord in the process. Neither his build, which was not designed for acrobatics, nor his contemporary costume of sandals, long tunic and cloak, which got tangled in his line, helped matters. But he had finally made it safely, and, equally importantly, unobserved. Fortunately, the upper levels of the temple seemed to be practically deserted at that hour, which was by then some time after midday. Perry had been treated to a rapid sequence of images showing stairs, marble columns, a large statue of Cleopatra dominating the end of a lofty chamber, an entrance hall, and the sun streaming in through large doors. Briskly, the Doctor had descended the broad flight of steps down to the plaza that opened before the temple tomb. When he was well clear, he turned around to examine their impromptu place of concealment from the outside. For the first time, Perry appreciated the visual impact of the line of towering columns that fronted the building, and how the eye automatically followed them up, past the blocks of the massive decorated entablature to the pyramid cap that rose from the heart of the building and seemed ready to pierce the sky. You had to hand it to the ancients, she conceded. When it came to architecture, they knew how to make a statement, which in this case was this. This building is dedicated to somebody who was really somebody, whose importance you will be reminded of every time you pass it by. The Doctor's first objective had been a practical but mundane visit to a money changer. By dint of going through the pockets in the TARDIS's huge wardrobe room, he had assembled a collection of old coins predating the present time, and hopefully exchangeable for local currency. 20 minutes after leaving the tomb, with Perry in electronic attendance, he had made his way to one of the city's market streets. To her eyes, the shops were singularly unimpressive, being hardly more than holes in the wall, with shutters opened wide to display their wares. Many occupied the ground floor rooms of apartment blocks or even small private villas, with pairs of shops often flanking their front entranceways. Signs, bearing symbols of their respective trades, projected out over the plaited awnings that shaded the shop fronts, almost touching their fellows across the narrow street. Above one was the self-explanatory device of a wooden disc painted to resemble a coin. Perry had, subconsciously, been expecting the 10 BC equivalent of armoured glass, or at least a lot of heavy bars. But the tiny bearded man with the scales who essayed the doctor's mixed offerings seemed to work entirely out of one massive iron-bound chest. Of course, Perry thought, the two huge plug-uglies who loomed behind him and brandished no-nonsense spiked clubs in a very obvious manner might perhaps compensate for any lack of passive security measures. After some negotiation, the doctor bartered his assorted coinage, no doubt at a very unfavourable exchange rate, for a modest sum of local money. He secured his new funds in his belt pouch and set off up the street again. "Where are you going now?" Perry inquired over the comlink. "The Central Forum," the doctor replied, his words sounding slightly slurred. The throat mic allowed him to talk back by sub-vocalizing without speaking aloud, but it took some practice. To an onlooker, it might appear that he was mumbling to himself. "It's the heart of the city's social and public life. Apart from learning of potential power sources, there might be some useful information about what has been going on here to be overheard." In fact, he came across something usefully informative at the next street corner. An alcove had been cut into the corner building to provide shelter for 3 mounted busts, rather in the manner of an official public monument, Perry thought, or a wayside shrine. Assuming the sculptor had done them justice, the 3 were all handsome people. 2 were men, 1 was a woman, and all were portrayed wearing laurel crowns. The man on the bottom right of the group, as Perry looked at them, was a little older than the other 2, with a distinctive high forehead, but they all seemed to have similar features, as though they were related. There were inscriptions carved into the alcove wall behind them, which the doctor had read rapidly. There was also, Perry couldn't help but notice, some graffiti adorning the official text. "These appear," said the doctor, "to be the triumvirate currently ruling the Roman dominion, and are all Cleopatra's children. The older man on the right is Ptolemy Caesar, her child by Julius Caesar, while the other 2 were fathered by Mark Antony, Cleopatra Selene, and Alexander Helios. Alexander, according to the inscription, is dictator of Rome." "You mean it's a title?" "Yes. Julius Caesar was made a dictator for life in 44 BC. It was about the highest office the Republic could bestow. Usually the post was only granted for short periods in an emergency, but there was the temptation to have the term extended. Ambition and power exact their price, as always." "What's the graffiti say?" "Well, it's not very complimentary to Alexander about certain taxes, or apparently for entertaining an ambition to be emperor. Selene is castigated simply for being Queen of Egypt. Old resentments die hard, it seems. Never mind. This is a start. I shall press onto the forum to see what else I can discover." The forum was an open space flanked by temples and public buildings, and overlooked by a row of statues mounted on columns and triumphal arch. It was thronged with people in 2s and 3s and larger groups. Some were sitting playing complex little games on boards, the details of which Perry could not make out. Others were involved in debates, some quite heated, which were gathering their own small crowds of interested bystanders. In one corner, an open-air court was apparently being held, with a proper seat for the magistrate and a bank of steps for the spectators. The doctor hesitated as he passed it, trying to hear the advocates' cases. "Come on, doctor," Perry said. "We don't need a lesson in Roman law right now." Reluctantly he moved on, pausing at each group that he came to, listening for anything that might prove useful. They overheard the makings of several potential scandals, and snatches of an abstruse discourse on the merits of Stoicism, but no further useful information. It was more or less at this point that Perry had become bored and frustrated, and turned down the volume. After some thought, she turned the volume up again and said, "Look, Doctor, this is fine in theory, But if nobody's conveniently giving a lecture on the history of the last quarter century for the benefit of displaced time travellers, then it's not going to do us a whole lot of good. Isn't there somewhere else you can try, like a library or something? Unfortunately, a Roman library is unlikely to be up to date on the most recent events in any usefully objective form. In any case, as I don't know exactly what questions to ask, and would rather not call attention to myself by revealing my suspicious ignorance of common knowledge, research is likely to take some time. Well, where else can you go to pump people for the straight gossip without them becoming suspicious? There was a contemplative silence at the other end, broken suddenly by a loud exclamation, which surprised those people standing near the doctor in the forum. Of course! In vino veritas! Huh? What do you mean? But the doctor was already asking directions to the nearest tabernae. Very shortly, the image on the monitor was bobbing forward at a brisk walking pace. As this made for confused watching, Perry took the opportunity to get up and stretch her legs. For a few minutes, she carefully examined the patches of feathers on her body again for any indication they had spread further. They still covered the fleshier parts of her arms and legs, with distinctly thicker growth about her ankles and calves. The diamond-shaped patch on her chest ran halfway to her navel. By twisting round in front of the mirror in her room, she could see a similar patch across her shoulders and running down her spine. There were markedly thicker tufts of feathers between her shoulder blades. Incipient wings, she wondered. She certainly couldn't recall feeling them on Varos, though, of course, she hadn't exactly been taking notes at the time. Still, it did suggest the past was not simply repeating itself. Perhaps, with the whole process occurring at a slower pace and not forced, it was more controlled. At least everything seemed stable for the moment. In fact, the feathers were not actually uncomfortable, she decided, feeling more like very soft, close-fitting wool, and were pleasantly warm. I guess that's why birds use them, she thought with a grin. She looked at the sharp talons that her nails had shaped themselves into. And I've seen longer than these, she told herself, worn at parties and painted scarlet. Pleased with her positive attitude, she idly walked to the exterior doors and peered out into the darkness, taking a breath of fresh air, and froze, listening intently. Faintly, but distinctly, she could hear the sound of metal clinking and scraping against stone. The tabernae under the sign of a brown bear certainly had atmosphere, conceded the doctor. An amalgam of stale beer, lamp oil, and sweat. The decor also lacked the charm normally associated with, for instance, the ideal English pub. The floor was carpeted with a mixture of rushes and sawdust that seemed in urgent need of changing. The bar, looming out of the gloomy interior, was a simple, rough-sawn table polished black by use, backed by an unstable-looking rack of shelves, carrying assorted jars, kegs, cups, and mugs, the latter either of pewter or carved wood. There were no glasses. He bought an unopened Schönix of wine, which was the equivalent of slightly less than a litre, and selected the cleanest cup he could see. He then scanned the room for his target. There were 2 or 3 huddles of people seated on stools and benches, hunched over the drinks, cluttering the bar's assorted drink-stained tables. But the doctor was looking for somebody sitting alone, preferably one who had reached that stage of needing to drink in company, even if there was nobody actually with him. Yes, in the corner of the room, a small man in late middle age. His clothes were somewhat drink-stained, but they looked of fair quality. His general appearance was that of a thinker rather than a manual worker. The doctor casually walked over to him. "Excuse me, good sir, but I am a stranger in town, and I hate to drink alone. May I offer you some wine?" The man looked up from his cup and tried to focus on the doctor. What, say? I said, repeated the doctor, speaking loudly and clearly, that I would like to join you in a drink. He waved the bottle helpfully before the man's eyes. Comprehension seemed to dawn. Yes, he slurred, gesturing with his cup and spilling its remaining contents. Sit down. Please yourself. What does it matter anyway? The doctor took a seat, steadied the man's cup, uncorked his own bottle, and poured out a generous measure. His own cup he only half-filled. Good health to you, he said cheerfully, sipping. The wine was palatable, but with a distinct sediment and a hint of vinegar. I am Doctor of TARDIS. May I inquire as to whom I have the pleasure of drinking with? The little man blinked slowly, frowning. TARDIS? Is that in Greece? A deceptively small island in the Cyclades. You would not have heard of it. But do I infer that you are from that fine land? His companion drew himself up a little. I am Themos of Perseus, philosopher of natural phenomena. The doctor beamed back at him. Master Themos, I think you are just the person I have been hoping to meet. Perry was kneeling on the ground just outside the TARDIS doorway, pressing her ear to the cold stone flags. For one wild moment, when she had first heard the sounds, she had visions of the mummy of Cleopatra lurching towards her out of the darkness. Then she realized the sounds were coming from below the level of the tomb chambers. Unmistakably, it was the sound of digging. From this observation, the image of tomb robbers came very naturally to mind. Why did they have to pick just now? She thought bitterly. Of course, it might be simply building work in the temple downstairs. Somehow she thought this was simply self-delusion. She got to her feet. All right. If it is tomb robbers, where are they going to come up? How long till they appear? And how do I break it to the doctor? So, how do you see the passage of history being affected by the progress of invention, Master Themos? The doctor ventured with studied carelessness. Say, for instance, over the last quarter century. There have been so many changes by way of material discoveries that have influenced society, have there not? Themos was nodding animatedly, if unsteadily. The doctor suspected he welcomed a companion to talk to. Nothing like it in all recorded history, he agreed. But what would you say was the major underlying cause of the changes? Themos blinked at him in puzzlement. Why, the Oracle of Alexandria. What else? Of course, the Oracle, said the doctor quickly, trying to sound as though he knew what he was talking about. But what I meant was the underlying factors beneath the obvious. I mean, the manner in which new concepts were applied. The human factor in their utilization. The element of chance, destiny, he trailed off lamely. This appeared to make sense to Themos, who made a wise pyramid of his fingertips, after a few preliminary failures at making them meet, drew himself together, and launched into a somewhat rambling lecture. Naturally, the timing of the discovery of the oracle off the coast of Alexandria was crucial. Truly it was said that Serapis smiled on the Queen of the East and her consort in that hour, and consider at what moment but that of imminent war would be so great a concentration of resources and effort be invested in turning the dreams of the oracle offered into reality. Imagine how the subsequent course of events might have run had this not occurred. Where would we be today? Where indeed, remarked the doctor dryly. Perry's voice suddenly buzzed in his ear. Doctor, I think something's happening here. The doctor hastily raised his cup to cover his lips and mouthed, Don't bother me now. Well, be like that then. And there was a click as she turned off. Perhaps by now, continued Themos, the revelation of the secrets of the steam-driven engine and the destructive force of the blasting powder that was so decisive at, Actium seemed quite commonplace, but I recall at the time... Back in the TARDIS, Perry was wondering if she hadn't been a little sharp with the Doctor. After all, he had obviously found someone useful to talk to. Perhaps it was just as well she hadn't told him. If he had tried to race back here against the clock, he might be seen getting onto the temple roof. Anyway, calling for the Doctor's help as soon as there was a problem had almost become a habit. Surely she could think of something herself. She must be able to outwit a bunch of ancient Roman tomb robbers. Think positive, she told herself again. Yes, she was sure she could come up with something. But it would mean going outside the TARDIS for a while. Perry took a deep breath. Well, hadn't she said she could cope with a few more feathers? This wasn't like before on Varos when she was panicked and confused. This time, she was in control. Leaving the recorder running, so that she could review whatever the Doctor had discovered later, she picked up a torch and strode purposefully out into the antechamber. Right. The first thing was to find exactly where they were going to come up. She worked her way around the chamber, listening intently, then started up the stairs for the treasure vault. The digging sounds definitely seemed louder in that direction. In the vault, she went down on her hands and knees again and searched for the focus. Eventually, she identified a floor slab about halfway along one of the aisles as being their likely point of emergence. Well, she thought, right on target, and they couldn't have more than a few feet to go. They would have a nice surprise when they lifted that slab. She sat back on her heels, grinning, and looked about her. Yes, there was bound to be everything she wanted here. She would see to it that they had the surprise of their lives. And after the consolidation of the Dominion, there came expansion into the northern lands and Africa and Persia. Then Ptolemy crossed to the east. Themos paused, as though troubled by something. Anyway, the Dominion enjoyed many years of stability under Cleopatra and Marcus Antonius, and there was a general increase in prosperity and well-being, which any thinking man can only applaud. This, I know, many have claimed, as proving the essential positive value of the Oracle devices. I say, however, that every sword has two edges, and the gods may well, if it amuses them, choose to give us devices that give us as much misery as benefit, and judge us by our capacity to use them sensibly, like these infernal wire lights, and their poles going up all over the city. I ask you, how can a man observe the stars at night with all that light hazing the sky, and that electrical factory on the plain, belching smoke and covering the place with black stuff, soot, every time the wind blows the wrong way? I have complained, but does anybody listen? The Doctor filed away the information about the generating station for future reference, then tried to steer Themos away from what was clearly his pet hate. But what is your opinion on current events, now that Antonius and Cleopatra have gone? Themos slipped his wine and considered the question blearily. Well, of course, their children were their only possible heirs. And fine people they are, too, he added hastily, with a quick glance about him as though concerned about who might be listening. But it must be admitted there have been tensions. The triumvirate by its very nature is not a stable entity. History teaches us that. And now, he frowned uncertainly. The Doctor poured him some more wine. Yes, he said encouragingly. Tell me what you think of things now. At the head of an almost vertical shaft rising through packed earth and rubble, Strabo's pick suddenly struck a solid slab above his head. He pulled down his dust mask and stared hard. Below him, Decius froze in the act of passing another prop to Tyro. Is it the floor? He asked, voice quivering with excitement. Tyro grabbed the work light and scrambled up the rungs of the shaft braces until he was level with Strabo. peering intently upward. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I think it is. Get Cass up here. Tell him we've made it." The division of the Dominion into East and West is really a product of different histories and populations. The requirements of the Oracle devices have served to exasperate matters. Take airships, for example. Apparently, the lifting gas for them needs electrical power to form it. Now, there are devices the Egyptians have for making this power directly from sunlight, but they work far more efficiently there than here. And the airship engines are not steam-powered, you know. Oh, no! But driven by a type of flammable oil, which they can find under the desert sands. The consequence is that it is rumoured that they have made more and larger airships than we in Rome. Well, there is one source of unease between our own dictator and his sister right away. And then, of course, there was the business of their mother's remains. Of course. Do tell me what you thought of that. Cassidorus's prominent front teeth fronted a triumphant smile. "I told you we'd get there any time. I said they'd only filled in the core with light stuff, didn't I?" "Well, that's modern building methods for you, isn't it?" sniffed Tyro. "I remember my dad doing walls years ago. Good solid work that was." "What, those blocks of insulae by the river?" said Decius. "They had to be shored up last year." "That wasn't his fault, that was subsidence." Lads, cut in Cassidorus. "Stop talking and fetch the jack. We've got a treasure vault to open." So it was largely due to Ptolemy Caesar's mediation that the dispute was settled. He pointed out that just because she died while in Rome, her proper resting place was in Alexandria, but the treasures she had accumulated whilst here should stay. Still, it had taken 3 years to resolve the matter, and her remains had already been interred in her tomb on the Viminal. Have you seen her tomb yet? "Just in passing," said the doctor. "So what was finally decided?" "Why, Cleopatra Selene is coming to collect her mother's remains. What is the date? Oh, yes. She arrives tomorrow. There will be special games and various celebrations. You know, the usual entertainments to please the masses. And then she'll take them back to Alexandria." The doctor had suddenly tensed. "You mean they'll be opening the tomb?" "What? No. The casket has already been removed. It's lying in state in the Temple of Serapis, I think it is." The doctor relaxed, looking relieved. "Oh, yes," continued Themos. "The tomb's all sealed up again now." The silence of the treasure vault was broken by the grating of stone against stone and the regular squeak, squeak of metal, as if a heavy screw thread was being turned. Slowly, the edge of a thick floor slab rose upward by little jerks, and a crack of yellow electric light became visible. Wooden wedges were thrust into the widening gap from below, and slowly the slab was levered up far enough to allow a man to pass through. Hesitantly, Cassidorus climbed out of the hole, carrying a hand lantern, and peered about him. After a moment, he gave a strangled gurgle of surprise. "By Juno's breast, we actually did it!" he spluttered, half to himself. "I never thought—" "What's that, Cass?" came a voice from below. Nothing. We're here, aren't we? Right where I planned. Where else did you think we'd be?" One by one, the robbers emerged from the shaft and looked about themselves in stunned silence. "Core, ain't it beautiful?" said Strabo in hushed tones. This seemed to break the spell. "Beautiful my arse," countered Tyro. "This is money, lad, and don't you forget it. Don't go soft and sentimental on us now." But there was a notable tone of awe in his words. Hesitantly, as though they were afraid it was all a mirage that might fade away at any moment, they started touching and caressing the priceless riches that surrounded them. They looked into one another's faces. Suddenly, they started breaking into helpless fits of half-choked laughter, and picking up the smaller ornaments and tossing them about, intoxicated by their success. All but Strabo, whose lumpy features were creased by a worried frown. Cass, he rumbled, you sure it's safe? I mean, she's not still in here, is she? Cassiodorus paused briefly in the middle of the impromptu jig he was dancing with Decius, whilst balancing the golden lid of an unguent jar on his head to reassure him. I told you already. They took her away a month ago to be shipped off to Egypt. That's why we had to hold off the digging for a while, remember? There's nobody here now except who disturbs the sleep of Cleopatra. The voice was female and eerily sepulchral. It echoed around the chamber, freezing the thieves into shocked rigidity, the dim lamplight casting their faces into rictuses of horror. In the centre of the chamber, what appeared to be a high chair draped in a sheet stirred. A white veil fell away, and the figure of a woman appeared to rise to her feet. She wore the headdress, gown, and jewellery of an Egyptian queen, but her eyes and mouth glowed a ghostly green, and patches of her skin seemed peculiarly mottled. She took 3 paces towards them, and raised an accusing hand. The thieves' petrified tableau suddenly dissolved into a mad scramble for the raised slab, punctuated by oaths and cries of pure terror, as they all tried to squeeze through the narrow gap at once. Then they were half falling down the shaft with a clatter of boots and rattle of dislodged stones from its walls. At that moment there was no other thought in their minds but to escape from whatever shade of the dead they had so unwisely disturbed. Later, Decius, who was the unwilling last member of that frantic group, swore that he heard terrible laughter floating down the shaft after them. Naturally, he didn't recognize that it had an American accent. Back in the treasure chamber, Perry peeled the strips of glow blob off her face, grinning in satisfaction. Carefully, she pulled one of the longer wedges free of the slab and used it to knock the others and the jackhead away. The slab fell back into place with a satisfactory boom and thump, closing the shaft once more. She dragged a low table out of the pile of funereal goods and set it over the slab, then stacked several smaller pieces of furniture and assorted ornaments on top. If they came back again this way, she'd know it. Returning to the centre of the chamber, she pulled the sheets off the throne chair and recovered the ancient gramophone horn and length of speaking tube, which had been concealed beneath it, to return them to the TARDIS. She removed Cleopatra's headdress and carefully carried it over to the ornate chest, where she had found it and the rest of her costume. The Queen of the Nile had certainly gone well prepared for the afterlife. "I hope you didn't mind me borrowing this," she whispered, on the general principle that it never hurt to be polite. "But it was in a good cause." Perry started to strip off the gown when she paused. Something one of the thieves had said came back to her, and it didn't make sense. She picked up her torch and went over to the door beyond which the doctor had said lay Cleopatra's actual mummy casket, and examined the rope seal tied across the handles. She pictured the similar type of seal they had cut away from the antechamber doors, and frowned. Quickly, she pulled off the rest of her disguise and returned it to the chest. She realized that her vestigial wings had definitely grown while she had been outside the protection of the TARDIS, and were chafing against the straps of her bra. Some sort of halter top would be more comfortable, she thought vaguely, more preoccupied with the puzzle she had just uncovered. She hurried back to the TARDIS to see if she could interrupt the doctor long enough to tell him about it. And to have something to eat, she added. Suddenly, she was feeling famished. In the Brown Bear, the quantity of wine he had imbibed was finally taking its toll on Themos, and he was starting to turn morose once more. Pity, he mumbled, about Ptolemy Caesar. Strong man, could have been a great leader like his father, but made mistake of going to the East. Cursed place. Nobody listened to what he found except me. I know what's there, and what it means." He focused mournful, bloodshot eyes on the doctor. "Should have saved your wishes of good health for yourself, Doctor." "Oh, why is that?" Themos gave a hollow, miserable laugh, and hung his head over his cup again. "Because the world is coming to an end," he said blankly.